In Uruguay, you even had a system where you had to request by the police a certificate of your political reliability, and each citizen was classified as A, B, or C, depending on the threat that you posed to the government. And if you were C, you were basically deprived of any opportunities to even have a job. So these dictatorships were really pervasive and very totalitarian. So this is a very short summary of what the dictatorships are about, and I apologize for that, but it's just to give you an overview. Once we get to the transition in the early 1980s in both Argentina and Uruguay, you have the first cycle of transitional justice. In Argentina, we have a very clear situation of a regime that collapsed. The military junta that was in power in Argentina was completely discredited on all fronts. It did very bad politically, it did extremely bad economically, the country's economy was in shambles. But it also did really bad militarily because it had the fantastic idea of invading the Falklands War and losing. So it even failed in the military sphere, which is the sphere where the armed forces are supposed to be performing. So at the end of the dictatorship, the Argentine government was completely discredited, and this created an opening for possibilities of accountability that we don't have, for example, in Uruguay, where you have a negotiated transition. And in Uruguay, you have the military commanders and the political parties that negotiate the way out of the regime, and there is secret accords in which they also agree the impunity of the outgoing regimes and all of the members. Another difference is that in Argentina you have a president, the newly elected president, that was a human rights activist. He was a lawyer to political prisoners during the dictatorship. He was a founding member of an NGO for human rights. So he had a very clear commitment, and he argued throughout his electoral campaign that you couldn't restore democracy on the basis of immorality. So you had to provide truth and justice for the victims of disappearances. In Uruguay, you have a completely opposite situation. The president that wins the election came from the party that was closest to the military regime, and he was actually the architect of the transition that, together with the head of the army, basically negotiated the way out of power. So President Sanguinetti in Uruguay had no intention whatsoever to favor justice or even truth. So in Argentina, we have the famous trial of the military commanders in 1985. That was actually the first time in Latin America where you had the military commanders prosecuted for crimes such as torture and the privation of liberty. And you also have the first Truth Commission to be established and to receive international attention and complete a report outlining the plight of the disappeared and their suffering. So this, in addition to the role of the president, you also had, as I was saying, the armed forces, which were completely discredited and had very limited power. However, by the late 1980s, you have a very different situation because, of course, the armed forces were not particularly impressed with the prosecution and the disclosure of their crimes. So we have 4 military rebellions, and the government in Argentina basically backtracks on their policy, and we have 2 amnesty laws being adopted. In Uruguay, at the same time, you also had an amnesty law being adopted because although the government didn't want to prosecute, they couldn't stop victims from presenting the cases to the courts. So in less than a year, you had over 700 cases in the courts. So the government adopts an amnesty law to basically bring an end to all the prosecutions. So this is a very rough summary of the first phase of transitional justice, where we have an approach of truth and limited justice in Argentina and a situation of complete amnesty in Uruguay. In the second phase that covers the 1990s and the early years of the 21st century, we have a similar situation in both countries because we have a situation of impunity and silence. We have the pardons in the early 1990s where the Argentine government pardons even some of the officers that had been convicted and sentenced. And in Uruguay, you have a referendum in which the amnesty law is confirmed by the majority of the people. So these 2 symbolic moments sort of seal the question of the past. But this is also an important phase because it's actually in the 1990s where civil society mobilization becomes particularly essential. And I don't have time to go through all of the mechanisms, but if you're interested, we can talk about it later. But in both Argentina and Uruguay, you have civil society going to the UN treaty bodies, going to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to present cases and to try to put pressure on the internal, even though it was a democratic government, but it was still a government that wasn't interested in justice. So they tried to put pressure through the international system. And in particular in Argentina, I think they develop a remedy that I think could be useful for the case of Iran in the time being when there is no transition in Iran. And they developed this idea of the truth trials. An Argentine NGO came up with the argument saying that, okay, we have amnesty laws, we cannot have prosecutions because these are blocked. But you cannot stop the victims from asserting their right to truth. They have the right to know the final destiny of their loved ones. And society also has the right to know the methodology of state terrorism. So they developed this kind of hybrid mechanism that has elements of prosecutions and truth commissions. There were no sentences as the result of these truth trials, but what you had was a gathering of evidence and testimonies and a creation of an archive that is now being used as we speak in the new trials that have been happening in Argentina. And in Uruguay, you have a very similar situation. You have various attempts to use the international sphere to put pressure at home. But also, as somebody was mentioning earlier, we have the emblematic event of the arrest of General Pinochet. That was the Chilean dictator, but nonetheless, the powerful impact that this had went well beyond Chile. All of the countries in Latin America were galvanized by the fact that the king of the dictators was actually facing extradition in the UK. So, very quickly, we get to the current phase. And in Argentina, we've had, thanks to a president that was very interested in questions of justice, we had the amnesty law being completely annulled in 2003, and the Supreme Court has confirmed that in a recent decision. So nowadays we've had almost 1,800 people are being investigated for human rights crimes. There has been over 200 people being sentenced already in just 5 years of trials being resuming in Argentina. In Uruguay, the situation continues to be slightly more complicated because the government, even though we have a left-wing government that has proved to be more interested in issues of human rights, is far from what human rights and civil society would like to see. But we've had developments as well. There's been a recent sentence in February this year by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in which it has stated very clearly that the Uruguayan amnesty law is invalid because it's in violation of all human rights obligations that Uruguay has voluntarily ratified. And as I was just saying at the beginning, just today and tomorrow there's going to be this really important vote in the Uruguayan parliament in which they'll be hopefully derogating the amnesty law and declaring that the crimes of the dictatorship are crimes against humanity, so there is no statute of limitations that can be applied to those. So if I just have one final minute, just some lessons for the Iran case. In the beginning, when I was asked to present today, I wasn't too sure how I could contribute to this discussion because I thought my experience in Argentina and Uruguay was so different from the case of Iran. But as I was reading the report by Jeffrey Robertson, I realized that there were so many similarities that I really didn't expect before I began reading the report. I was particularly struck by the idea of the double death of the political prisoners, which is a concept that has also been used very much for the disappeared, because they've not only been killed by the state, but their own death has been denied for decades, because most of the relatives of the disappeared still don't have, like the relatives of the Iran political prisoners, a grave for their relatives to go and put a flower on. So I thought that was very powerful. And just a comment on the possible lessons or tools that we can take away from the case of Argentina and Uruguay. a particularly important tool has been resort to the inter-American system, which unfortunately is not available for Iran. But another important tool has been the use of prosecutions abroad, particularly in Italy, Spain, France, Sweden, and Germany, both on claims of universal jurisdiction, but also the passive personality principle, because many of the victims had double nationalities. And this was a really powerful way to put the Argentine and Uruguayan government in shame, because people couldn't achieve justice at home. They had to go overseas and be publicly humiliated. And finally, as I was saying, this idea of the right to truth that has been endorsed by both the inter-American system but also the UN General Assembly. They have a declaration on the right to truth. So I think in the current context where there is no transition in Iran, these are hopefully some suggestions that can be used for the victims.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And I feel that what this panel has certainly said to me is that the ways forward for justice are varied, but they're possible. And so with that in mind, I'd like to open it up, and I'm going to take a similar structure to what Phil did. We'll gather a few questions together, and then I'll give the panelists a chance to respond to them as a whole. So if I could open it up to the floor.
Yes. I have a question maybe for you, because you talked about the options of using transitional justice, especially in the case of Iran, which is happening outside, as a tool for regime change, political tool, or as a way to have the government open up. And the third hope that we have is that perhaps, talking about what happened in the past and having the victims' testimonies maybe will help dissidents now in Iran and activists and people who have something to say to be safer than they used to be in the 1980s. The role of deterrent in that discussion, because the government watches and people have cell phones now, we have films, we have internet, but in the 80s we didn't. But if we don't talk, the government gets the message that you can do whatever you want at any time to anyone. So talking also has this function, this justice, or talking about justice has also maybe a little bit of a deterrent function.
Yeah. For brilliant presentations. What's interesting to me is, firstly, clearly how much detailed knowledge you all have of the case studies that you've been talking about. And it's obviously very hard-won knowledge from field work and time spent in the country. I've got a question which I'd be really interested to hear all of you sort of answer, which is based on your field work in these contexts you've been talking about, how important is the punishment of senior perpetrators, as opposed to other conceptions of justice that might be relevant in those contexts? Justice defined as compensation, justice defined as rehabilitation, justice perhaps even defined as the restoration of relationships between different parties. I mean, I'm hearing bits and pieces of all of these different conceptions of justice, but I'm just wondering, in each of your cases, how important are you seeing the punishment of senior perpetrators versus these other ways of thinking about justice?